I always knew I was the second choice. It wasn't some dramatic realization that hit me one day. It was just the way things were. My parents never tried to hide it. My older sister, Lauren, was the golden child, the one with the straight-A report cards, the perfect extracurriculars, the bright future. I was the backup, the disappointment, the one expected to settle for whatever scraps life threw my way. But until that night, I had never heard them say it out loud. I was coming home from my shift at the diner, exhausted, smelling like grease and burnt coffee, when I overheard them in the kitchen. My name stopped me cold. I should have walked away. I should have gone straight to my room and ignored it like I always did. But something about the way my father said my name, clipped and dismissive, made me freeze.
"She'll be fine where she is," he said.
"She's not cut out for more than that." My mom's voice was softer, hesitant. "But Jess works hard. Maybe we could."
"No."
"We put the money where it matters. Lauren has a future."
Jess made her choice.
My stomach clenched. My choice? I was working a dead-end job because they never believed in me. Because every time I tried to prove myself, they shrugged it off, told me I wasn't like Lauren. And now, they were going to pay for her law school while I was expected to keep wiping down diner tables? I took a step closer. My father sighed. "We can't afford to waste money on both of them, and let's be honest, Jess isn't worth the investment." I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I wasn't worth it. That was what my own father thought of me. Not just that Lauren deserved more. No, he was saying I deserved nothing. A part of me wanted to storm in, scream at them, demand to know why they never believed in me. But instead, I stood there, gripping the strap of my purse so tightly my fingers ached. The truth was right in front of me, undeniable, and it crushed me in a way I couldn't explain. I stepped into the kitchen, and they both turned to look at me. My mother's face paled. She knew I had heard. My father? He just looked annoyed, like I was an inconvenience. For the first time in my life, I didn't swallow it down. I didn't pretend it didn't hurt. I let it all spill out. The years of being overlooked, dismissed, treated like an afterthought. How I had spent my whole life trying to earn even a fraction of the love they showered on Lauren. How I had done everything I could to prove I was just as good, only to be told over and over again that I would never measure up. By the time I was done, my chest was heaving, my face hot with anger and humiliation. My father didn't even flinch. He just shook his head, already tired of me. "Are you done?" he asked. That was it. That was all he had to say. No apology, no regret. Just another dismissal, like always. I walked past them, up to my room, and started packing. I wasn't going to stay in a house where I was just a burden. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't care. I just knew I had to get out. Lauren was in her room when I walked past. She must have heard everything, but she didn't come out. She never did. She had her future secured, and she wasn't going to risk it for me. I grabbed my things, threw them into a bag, and walked downstairs. My mother was in the hallway, eyes red-rimmed, like she had been crying. She reached for me, but I stepped back. I wasn't interested in comforting her guilt. "Jess," she whispered, "please don't." But I was already out the door. The night air was cold against my skin as I stepped outside, the weight of years of rejection pressing down on me. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay here. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. There was only one name that made sense. Aunt Margaret. She was the black sheep of the family, the one who didn't fit in, the one my parents never talked about. And maybe that was exactly why I needed her now. I hit dial and took a deep breath, bracing myself for whatever came next. The moment Aunt Margaret picked up the phone, I knew I had made the right call. She didn't hesitate. She told me to come over, gave me her address, and stayed on the line until I was safely inside an Uber. When I arrived at her house, a small, cozy place on the outskirts of town, she was already waiting at the door, arms crossed, the same no-nonsense expression she always had at family gatherings. She didn't say much, just ushered me inside, made me a cup of tea, and sat down across from me. It was the first time in years that someone in my family looked at me like I mattered. She let me talk. I didn't hold back. I told her everything. The diner, the overheard conversation, the way my father had dismissed me like I was a piece of furniture. Margaret listened, nodding here and there, her face unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she reached into a drawer and pulled out a plain, brown envelope. She slid it across the table. "I knew this day would come," she said. I frowned, confused. She gestured for me to open it, and inside, I found stacks of $100 bills, more money than I'd ever seen in my life. "I started saving when you were 10, she admitted. "I saw how they treated you. I knew one day you'd need a way out." I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe. For the first time in my life, someone had chosen me, planned for me, believed in me when no one else did. Then came the knock at the door. My stomach twisted as I heard my mother's voice, muffled through the wood. She was pleading. She wanted to talk. Margaret didn't even flinch. She opened the door just enough to step outside, closing it firmly behind her. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught the desperation in my mother's voice. She told Margaret that I was being irrational, that I needed to come home, that this was just a misunderstanding. I heard Margaret's response, calm, sharp, cutting through my mother's excuses like a knife.
"She heard you," Margaret said.
"She knows exactly how you feel about her. There's no misunderstanding." For the first time in my life, someone was standing up for me. Not making excuses, not telling me to be the bigger person. Just defending me. And it was my mother who faltered under the weight of it. When Margaret came back inside, she locked the door and sat down like nothing had happened. I stared at her, at the money, at the quiet certainty in her posture.
And I knew.
I wasn't going back. Taking a deep breath, I told her my plan. I wanted to go to business school. I wasn't going to be the girl working dead-end jobs while my family pretended I didn't exist. I was going to make something of myself, not for them, but for me. Margaret smiled. Just a small, satisfied curve of her lips. "Good," she said. "It's about damn time." I clutched the envelope tighter, my heart pounding with something I hadn't felt in years.
Hope.
But as I sat there, planning my next steps, I knew one thing for sure. My family wasn't done with me yet. Getting into business school felt like stepping into a whole new world. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the afterthought. I wasn't the disappointment. I was just another student, grinding through assignments, pushing toward a future that was finally mine to shape. And I was good at it. Better than I ever thought I could be. A year and a half passed faster than I expected. The weight of my parents' rejection never fully left me, but with Margaret's support, I built something for myself. A routine. A purpose. I thought I had left everything behind, but then she called me one evening, her voice tense. Lauren's life had just imploded. Margaret didn't sugarcoat it. Lauren's fiancé, Ryan, had been arrested in a financial scandal. Securities fraud, money laundering, the kind of crimes that made headlines. Overnight, their perfect life crumbled. Lauren had been splashed across the news as the woman engaged to a criminal. And the worst part? She knew. She had known about his shady dealings and stayed silent. I should have felt vindicated. After all the years of being treated like I was lesser, I should have celebrated that she was finally facing consequences. But I didn't. Instead, there was this dull, hollow ache in my chest. Margaret told me our parents were scrambling to protect Lauren. They were selling the beach house, the same house where we had spent our childhood summers, the same house I wasn't even allowed to visit after I left. They wouldn't lift a finger to help me get an education, but now they were throwing everything they had into saving Lauren. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was just the same old pattern, playing out on a grander scale. Lauren made her choices, and they rushed in to clean up the mess. I had made mine, and they had let me go without a second thought. Then, just when I thought I was done with it all, my phone rang. An unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something told me to pick up. It was Lauren. She sounded exhausted, defeated in a way I had never heard before. There was no superiority in her voice, no quiet condescension, just raw desperation. She told me she needed my help. She admitted she had known what Ryan was doing, but had been too scared to act. Too scared of losing the life she had built, too scared of what people would think. Now, she was drowning, and for the first time in her life, she had nowhere to turn. I sat there, gripping my phone, listening to the sister who had always had everything handed to her finally ask for something she couldn't take for granted. She didn't just want my help, she needed me. And, against all logic, I agreed. Not for Lauren. Not for my parents. For the truth. I didn't know what I was walking into, but one thing was clear. The past wasn't done with me yet. Helping Lauren cut a deal with the prosecution wasn't easy. It took hours of calls, negotiations, and finding the right attorney who could make it happen. But in the end, she agreed to testify against Ryan. It was the only way to keep herself out of prison. Watching her unravel was surreal. The confident, polished sister I had grown up with was gone. She was terrified. And for once, I was the one with control. Just as I thought things were moving forward, my parents found a way to pull me back. They didn't call to apologize, didn't acknowledge that I was the only reason Lauren had a shot at freedom. Instead, they wanted me to walk away. To let Ryan get away with it. They said testifying would ruin our family name. That it wasn't too late to fix things. My father's voice was steady, but I could hear the quiet desperation beneath it. He wasn't used to being powerless. I didn't let him manipulate me. I told him Lauren had already made her choice. That I had made mine. And I hung up before he could say another word. Lauren wasn't the only one facing consequences. She knew there was no going back. Her career was over, her reputation shattered. She had spent her entire life climbing, and now there was nothing left to hold on to. I should have felt satisfied watching her fall, but I didn't. It was just another reminder of how fragile everything was. Then the news came about Grandpa. He had lived out in Arizona, far from the family, keeping to himself. I barely knew him, but he had always been different from my parents. Quiet, reserved, but oddly kind. When he passed, I didn't expect much. Maybe a card, maybe nothing. But then I got the call from his lawyer. He had left his estate to me and Lauren. Split evenly. If converted to cash, we'd each walk away with $450,000. I was stunned. My parents were furious. They didn't even try to hide it. The moment they found out, they called me, saying that the money could fix everything for Lauren. That I didn't really need it, that I should do the right thing. They didn't ask. They expected. Like always. I could have laughed. After years of being told I wasn't worth investing in, suddenly I was supposed to be their savior. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I wasn't the forgotten daughter desperately seeking approval. I wasn't someone they could control. For the first time in my life, I held the power. And I wasn't giving it up. I told them no. I was done playing by their rules. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a player. And for the first time, they had to watch from the sidelines. Margaret had always been the one to see things for what they really were. So when she sat me down and told me the truth, I wasn't surprised. Just furious. Ryan hadn't just stumbled into our family. He wasn't some unfortunate mistake Lauren had made. My parents had orchestrated the entire thing. Ryan had been working with my father years before he even met Lauren. The introduction, the engagement, everything had been planned. My father had needed leverage. Someone inside his operation who wouldn't turn on him. Marrying Ryan into the family had been the insurance policy. As long as Ryan was tied to us, he wouldn't flip. If he ever thought about going to the authorities, he'd be bringing his own wife down with him. Lauren had been a pawn. And she never even knew it. I felt sick just thinking about it. All these years, I had assumed she was the favored child, the one who had everything handed to her. But in reality, she had just been another asset in my father's empire. Margaret had proof. Bank records, emails, paper trails that linked my father's business to Ryan's illegal deals. She had kept them for years, waiting for the right moment. And now it was in my hands. For the first time, Lauren and I stood on the same side. She had lost everything, her reputation, her career, and now the illusion that our parents ever truly cared about her. But instead of breaking, she did something I never expected.
She fought back.
Together, we took everything to the authorities. We handed over the records, the evidence that tied our father to Ryan's crimes. The business that had kept our family afloat for years crumbled overnight. When my father found out, he called me, furious, demanding to know how I could betray my own blood. But I didn't owe him an explanation. I hung up, knowing it was the last time I'd ever hear his voice. Lauren, for the first time, stood with me instead of against me. She refused to take any of their money, refused to go back to them. The golden child was gone, and in her place was someone who finally saw the truth. With my parents out of my life, I turned to my own future. I stayed in business school, focused on something real, something I built myself. And I wasn't alone. Daniel, one of my classmates, became my business partner. What started as a study project turned into something more. We had ideas, ambition, and now we had a real shot at making something out of it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting to be seen. I wasn't proving my worth to anyone. I was just living. And I was finally free.